Hi, it's Colin. Make sure to subscribe to the Volume YouTube channel so you don't miss any episodes. You know, like Eli Manning did.
Eli's late. Hey, we're on this interview. You calling in? What are you doing?
What?
We're on this interview.
Oh, my bad. Sorry, I forgot about it.
You're killing me. You're killing me.
He's a New York Times best-selling author of 12 books, A Season in the Sun, the inside story of Bruce Arians, Tom Brady, and the making of a champion. And Lars Anderson had previously written a book co-authored with Bruce Arians 3-4 years ago called The Quarterback Whisperer. And so what I find interesting is the relationship, Lars, that you have with Bruce. And we were talking as we were preparing for this interview today that if you wrote the story of this season, it's ludicrous. Brady misses out on 1,500 snaps. We're in a pandemic. He walks into a house of a stranger looking for Byron Leftwich. He's doing high school practice. He creates practices at a high school football field that a local affiliate gets on video from a helicopter. I'm not sure he got in trouble with that or not. The whole thing was sort of make it up as they go. And I wondered, with your relationship with Bruce Arians, when it was all said and done, was even Bruce a little surprised? I mean, it looked so chaotic on that Thursday night in Chicago. It was like almost duct taping things together week to week. With your relationship with Bruce, when it was all over, a little surprised, a scale of 1 to 10, a 3. I mean, it is almost a ludicrous, hard to believe script in what happened.
Yeah, especially one with how the season started, going into New Orleans and getting thumped, and Tom throws a pick six and throws another interception, and then Bruce publicly criticizes Tom. And everybody was already like, in the national media, the marriage is over, it's dead. And then when they're 7-5 going into the bye, there were some pundits who were calling for Bruce's job, saying, hey, this isn't working. The Bruce Arians offense and the Tom Brady offense, absolutely not working. But, they kept grinding away. And eventually, as I said on your show the other day, and thank you for having me on your show, and thank you for having me on your podcast, Colin. You've been a huge advocate for this book. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. They had a melding of Tom's offense and BA's offense. Now, could Bruce have envisioned that they were going to be this good this fast? No. When they were 7-5, you know what Bruce was thinking? We're going to start preparing for next year. We're going to use these last games of the season to get ready for next year. He did not think it was going to click as quick as it did. And, he didn't say that publicly, but that's what he was thinking privately. That's what he was saying to Jason Light, the general manager. He's like, hey, we're 1 year away. But, when he was recruiting Tom and then Tom signs, one of the first things that Bruce said to Tom was, we are really good, but our players don't know it because of this culture of losing. And Jameis Winston the previous year, 30 touchdowns, 30 interceptions, the last throw of Jameis's career for Tampa was a pick six in the shortest overtime game in the history of the NFL. And afterward, you could just see the exasperation on Bruce's face when he just said, Jameis does so many great things, but he also does so many terrible things. And so Bruce knew in his own mind, he didn't share this with his assistant, that he had to move on from Jameis. And really who they were targeting was Teddy Bridgewater. They thought Bridgewater is going to be our guy. He's from Florida. He'll want to come back home. And then slowly they get word that Brady could be interested. And if you remember, at the NFL Combine. So this is pre-pandemic, right before the pandemic hits.
Yeah.
All the coaches get their time up at the microphone, right, and in front of the national media. And Bruce is asked, "Hey, who do you want to be your quarterback?" And he just said Tom Brady, and he had no idea. But you know what he was doing? He was sending a message that went all the way up to New England and through the big iron gates of Tom's mansion, letting Tom know and Tom's agent, we want Tom.
That's interesting. The ghost of Belichick, as I read the book, you can kind of feel it in the pages, is that every great coach, Lars, has a weakness. And with Belichick, I think it's often with skill people. He's a defensive coach. He's missed on a lot of wide receivers in the league, in college. He struggled with tight end drafts, running back drafts, very hit and miss. And I could make the argument that he missed on Brady, that he thought it was about Tom aging, and it was really a lack of self-reflection, that he had created such a poor group of skill people. As I read the book, I wonder deep down, when you did this book and talked to Tom, and Tom has the proverbial chip on the shoulder, but I wonder when Tom, at some point in New England, realized we just can't draft receivers. Even now, with the $200-300 million in free agency, it still remains the weakest receiving core in the league. So even when acquiring Mohamed Sanu for a second or third round pick, Nelson Aguilar, Kendrick Bourne, he's still not good at it. They still have nobody that separates. Do you think, in your book, Tom makes the decision about a year out, but I wonder if he was having questions before that.
I do. And look, Tom didn't dig deep on this with me, and it wasn't like I spent a ton amount of time with Tom for this book, but pretty much everybody around him. I think, Colin, it can be distilled into something very simple. He did not feel appreciated by his boss. If it's me, right, I want to be appreciated by my editors. Even Colin Cowherd, as successful as you are, you want to be appreciated for your job. And Tom did not feel appreciated. Belichick, who acts as the de facto GM, wouldn't give him the contract extension. And, Belichick, in Tom's mind, was ready to move on. And Tom's last throw, ironically enough, I said Jameis Winston's last throw was a pick six. Tom's last throw as a Patriot was a pick six. And as I mentioned to you when we did the show, that Clyde Christensen and Jason Light and Bruce, they went back and analyzed every single throw that Tom made the previous two seasons, and they realized he still got it. He still got it. And eventually they put a radar gun on him, still got the same velocity that he had in the prime of what we thought would be the prime of his athletic career. And they was the conclusion that they came to is just what you said, didn't have the weapons around him. So why does Tampa become so appealing? Well, for starters, they got Chris Godwin, they got Mike Evans, they got OJ Howard, they have a young, really good offensive line. There was no promises that they were going to draft Tristan Wirfs out of Iowa, but he becomes maybe the best tackle in the best young tackle in the league. They certainly hit the ballpark out of that with him, and then also a young, aggressive defense and a talented defense. And it took Tom to come in, and this is what the mandate from Bruce was: you need to make them know that they're good. And what did but Tom just walking into the building changed everything. And there's this one scene that I think is so powerful. It is when Tom and the players are out on the practice field for the first time. And it's just the trainers who can be out on the field. The coaching staff is up on the second floor. There's floor to ceiling windows. and they are all basically like have their noses pressed to the window, right? It's like they're at the zoo trying to find, you know, the most incredible animal, right? In the cage or whatever. And then Tom Brady walks out, and they're just like, oh my God, he's really here. Oh my God, he's really here. And even in that first practice, you could see linemen, if they missed a block, oh, sorry, Tom, not going to happen again. Sorry, Tom. Wide receiver drops the ball. Tom, not going to happen again. Not going to happen again. So what I'm trying to say is nobody wanted to disappoint Tom because of his track record, his background, and the immense respect that everyone had for him. And imagine how hard it is for Tom to come into a situation to be sort of the leader of the team. And he organized those offseason, those workouts at that high school with Rob Gronkowski coming. And you know, he was very demanding. And he didn't really have a personal relationship with many of the guys, but suddenly you had DBs showing up because they wanted to be there. You had offensive linemen showing up. I mean, traveling across the country to be there. And it's all because of the respect for Tom. And truly, one person changed the entire culture, the entire focus of the organization.
You know, it's interesting, Lars, that during the pandemic, some teams, even this year, the Colts struggled with it. Tampa never did. And it's interesting. There must have been messaging in your book, I think, with the COVID the first year. So that respect Tom brings into the table, I think, had great influence. Nobody's going to disrupt a game or a practice for Tom. But if you go back and remember, a lot of teams, there were many disruptions. And if I recall, the Buccaneers didn't have any COVID disruptions in a region, by the way, which was pushing back on some mandates and some vaccines. Take me to that process, because I think sometimes we're removed from that now. But boy, that year, we had games moved and canceled, Lars.
Absolutely. And I mean, it started with Bruce, right? And I'll try to keep the language.
Sure. This is a podcast. Fire away.
Okay. I'll try to keep it as clean as possible.
All right.
But first staff meeting Bruce has with his coaches. Tom Moore is Bruce's top lieutenant.
Yeah.
82 years old. Yeah. Former, I think he was either quarterback's coach with Bruce when they were at Indy together. Tom's a great guy. And he's got so much knowledge, so many great stories. And Bruce essentially said, if any of you MFs, talking to all the coaches, get me or Tom sick, I've got a gun, I'm going to shoot you in the knees. Okay. So it started with that. And then Rob Gronkowski signs, and Bruce has, he had his reservations about Rob.
Party Rob. Yeah.
Because when Bruce was calling games for CBS, he did a Patriots game, and he saw that Rob, one, couldn't get any separation. He had like all this body armor on. He looked to Bruce like a broken player.
Sure.
And in retrospect, it was Jason Light and Bruce just taking Tom Brady's word on blind faith that Rob can still play, because they didn't get a chance to work him out, nothing. So they signed Rob. First day that Rob comes into the building at One Buck Place. This is one of my favorite stories in the entire book. There's signs everywhere outside of the elevator. In the elevator, it says one person at a time in the elevator. And the coach's offices, again, are on the second floor. Rob is in the elevator with a Bucs employee. The two come up, doors open. Who's standing right there but Bruce? And Bruce is just like, you stupid motherfucker. And he is just going off on Rob. Can't you read a fucking sign? Don't you know what the fuck this says? Pardon my language, but I'm just telling you exactly what happened. And Rob being, so Bruce goes on and on and on. And after Bruce is done with his diatribe, Rob gives this sort of, a goofy smile and says, "Nice to meet you, Coach."
By the way, Gronk's first year, Lars, he still looked like a broken player. I think this year he looked like he'd worked out. I mean, if you remember, he came to Tampa the first 4 or 5 weeks. I mean, he was a broken player. I mean, there's something about that Tampa humidity, that southern sun, because I thought this year he looked much more nimble, much twitchier than he did last year. It was also, one of the things I love about Arians, it's a very unique coaching staff. So Tom really didn't know Byron Leftwich. He'd probably, I think he played against him at one point down in Jacksonville. Yep. And then there was a woman on the staff, 2 women. He had previously hired the name Jen Welter in Arizona. So talk about the coaching staff. Todd Bowles obviously faced Tom as the Jets head coach. It's a really unique staff. Did that make it easier, more difficult, during the process of Tom?
I mean, they joke about their Temple South, because Bruce's first head coaching job was at Temple back in the late 80s, I believe. And so many of the staff members have connections to Bruce going all the way back to Temple. And Todd Bowles was his defensive captain there. Lori Locust, who you mentioned, assistant D-line coach, she went to Temple and was a student there, and several others. And also what's unique about the staff is the offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, special teams coordinator, assistant head coach, all African-American. First time in NFL history that's happened. And but basically everyone on that staff had a previous relationship with Bruce. And that was one of Bruce's selling points to the Glazers when he interviewed. And by the way, when Bruce went in for his interview, you know what he carried with him? Not a 3-ring binder, not like a 3-year plan. He had his wallet and his keys. That's it. That is it. And that's very rare, right? And I think he dropped his first F-bomb in about 3 minutes into the interview. But the Glazers had seen the Amazon series, All or Nothing. So they knew Bruce's colorful language.
Right.
And so they weren't shocked by that. And so Bruce interviewed, and he said, "Look, the stars have aligned because I can get Todd Bowles. I can get Byron Leftwich." Leftwich had been fired from after getting a very brief tryout as the OC in Arizona, and Byron had been Bruce's quarterback in Pittsburgh, and Bruce took the job on the condition. I should say, Chris, Bruce's wife, let Bruce take the job on the condition that he give up play calling duties, because she was worried that he was going to basically stroke out on the sideline. Sure. Because he'd get so stressed. But to Bruce, Byron can actually call the offense better than him, because even though he designed it, he never played it. And Leftwich has played it. And not only that, Leftwich was the same style of quarterback as Brady, not mobile, have to make plays from the pocket,
yep,
and maneuver around. And so the two had so much in common. And so Bruce knew everybody he wanted to hire right away. And funny thing is, like, next day, the Bucs had Bruce go take a physical. Bruce was a little nervous about this. And after, getting poked and prodded in places where he'd never been poked or prodded before, the doctor comes out and he's like, "Doc, did I pass? Did I pass?" He's like, "Yeah, I give you a D+, C-." And Bruce is like, "Yes, that's better I did in college. I passed."
You wrote a book with Nick Saban 10 years ago, if I recall, right?
I wrote a book. I've written actually 2 books on Nick. One was called The Storm and the Tide, about I think that's what you're referring to, about the tornado that ripped through Tuscaloosa, Alabama on April 27, 2011. Yes.
So you're a professor at Alabama in journalism. So you know Nick and you know Arians. You would see them. I would see them as two completely different people. And I'm sure there are several distinctions. Are there any similarities between the two personalities?
That's a great question. I've never been asked that before. I think the intensity with which they approach, and I think there is a misconception of Nick Saban that he doesn't have personal relationships with his players. You know, Bruce was on Bear Bryant's final staff in 1982, right? And this has to be correct, but Bruce must be the only active coach who still has like direct ties to Bear Bryant. And Bear Bryant's philosophy was, and this is Bruce's philosophy. Bruce has one picture hanging in his office, and that's of Bear Bryant, and it is coach them hard, hug them harder. And Nick Saban doesn't seem like this touchy-feely guy, but yet he is very much a paternal figure to his players. In the same way that, I mentioned on the show the other day that Bruce wants to be viewed as the cool uncle you want to have a beer with, but at the same time, he will certainly dispense words of wisdom and be there for his players when they're having off the field issues. Last year, there came a point when Leonard Fournette was not getting the ball very much.
That's right.
And several games. And there was one, I think it was a walkthrough practice where Fournette just sat on his helmet the entire time, didn't participate. And Bruce called him over and said, look, take 20 minutes, go into the locker room, call whoever you need to call, and then come back out here and tell me if I need to cut you. And again, using very colorful language. I apologize for the language earlier.
No, I love it. This is why God created podcasts.
And tell me if I need to cut you. And then Fournette did that, comes back out and says, Coach, we're good. And since then, Leonard Fournette, not been an issue. And you know what? He respected Bruce so much, he re-signs with the Bucs for this year. And you could make the argument that the Bucs don't win the Super Bowl last year without Leonard Fournette. You know, when Brady made that key throw in the NFC Championship game to Scotty Miller right before half, right? The touchdown that Tampa scored. You know who threw the key block on that? It was Leonard Fournette. Without Fournette making that block, Brady doesn't have time to make that throw. And that's the key play, I would argue, not just of that game, but of the season for the Bucs.
Interestingly, speaking of relationships, Tom Brady and Antonio Brown have I would imagine the most, a surprisingly close relationship.
Yeah. I mean, when it was, Tom was constantly going into the offices of BA and Jason Light, again, the general manager, saying, we got to sign Antonio. We got to sign Antonio, got to sign Antonio. And he kind of just wore them out. And so finally they call Antonio in after some of his legal stuff had been resolved. They get him into the building, and Antonio said all the right things. And so Bruce and Jason decided to take a chance. And again, this is almost like more blind faith in Tom. And I don't want to overstate that Tom played this role of assistant general manager, but he certainly impacted the influence or impacted the decisions that Jason Light ultimately made. And then, when Antonio flies into Tampa, he doesn't know anybody in Tampa. So Tom actually picks him up at the airport. Who picks up people at the airport these days, Colin? and then, Tom was living in Derek Jeter's mansion, the biggest house in Tampa. He recently sold, or Jeter recently sold it, but he and Giselle lived there last year. And Antonio Brown stayed with them for a week or two. and just the two would go over the playbook together. And now, well, you just go back to last season, how important Antonio Brown became to that team. And I think, I know he's hurt right now, but moving forward this year, Antonio Brown is going to be an immensely important player for Tampa Bay.
Well, they have so much depth on the roster. Gronk and AB, older players, this is the value of depth. Alabama football has this. You can rest players an extra week or two. They've got depth at wide receiver and tight end. That's kind of the unspoken edge Tampa really has, is that when you have that kind of depth in the defensive line, wide receiver and tight end, you don't have to rush anybody back. I mean, Kyler Murray this week may play for Arizona, and they're acknowledging he could literally sit out 3 games, and that would probably be the perfect anecdote to his injury. But
if you don't mind me, sorry to interrupt. What was your reaction when you first got word that Tom Brady was signing with the Bucs?
I actually, in a bit of good fortune, broke the story. I was on the air in Sherman Oaks, California, in a building, and a friend of mine who is not an NFL source, he's a basketball source, but he hangs in a very elite world, said, call me during the break. He's a fan of the show. I did. And he said, Giselle said he can play in Tampa. Florida works. They're not doing cold weather. LA's too far away. I literally hung the phone up, came back, went on the air with it. And for the only time in my life, I beat Jay Glazer and Adam Schefter to a story. And my initial reaction, Lars, was, oh, wait, it makes sense. Carolina, Atlanta had quarterbacks that were older. Drew Brees was older. So part of Tom's success in New England was it was a dysfunctional, chaotic division. So here you had older Matt Ryan. Drew Brees is close to the end. The Cam Newton situation that had sort of peaked. And the other thing was, Tom's, like a lot of people that moved to Florida, Tom is older. He's a California kid. He's tired of the cold weather. And I'm like, oh, this makes sense. They're loaded at wide receiver. He had a very intense, no fun coach. Now he goes to Cocktails at 5 Bruce, loaded at wide receiver, warm weather. And I've always believed, Lars, this is kind of one of my theories because I've moved to different networks and different jobs, that when you leave a place that you've been successful, you take 75 to 80% of the system that worked for you, but you choose a place that has 2 or 3 things the other place didn't have. The coach in New England, too intense. The wide receivers, awful. The weather in playoff time, brutal. And so the moment it happens, I'm like, oh, check, check, check. Those are the 3 things that New England could not provide him with. In fact, Lars, my biggest concern, and I said this multiple times, was I lived in Tampa for 2 years. Very laid back. There's almost an island culture. Ybor City, meet you there at 5:30. I said, how will Tampa deal with Tom's intensity? I'm like, I'm not worried about, completing passes in football, but I've seen Tom scream at Bill O'Brien and Josh McDaniel. Tampa, I cover the team for 2 years. I love the Glazers, but I'm like, it's a loose culture there. It is not intense. And as your book chronicles, the players were almost begging to be coached. They were begging for that intensity. So long story short, or short story long, that was kind of my reaction. I'm completely shocked that it worked, but I was more concerned not about the fit and personnel, but the fit and personality with Tom.
And I know that Tom really enjoyed the fact that if it's a 1 p.m. Eastern kickoff, he could be at the Jeter Mansion by about 5 o'clock in the pool, hanging out with Giselle and just loving life, because where he was living was not far from Raymond James Stadium and One Buck Place.
Yeah. It is interesting. before we let you go. And the book is A Season in the Sun, the inside story of Bruce Arians, Tom Brady, the making of a champion, by Lars Anderson, who's a journalism professor at Alabama, has been so kind to give us 30 minutes. But it's a fascinating book, and I think it's the great dynasty in American sports. Kobe and Shaq. You get about 4 to 5 years out of these folks. Steph, KD, 4 to 5 years. Pittsburgh Steelers, Chuck Noll. You don't get 20. You don't get 2 10-year dynasties. It doesn't work that way. So I continue to think it along with the Michael Jordan documentary, it chronicles one of the most fascinating stories of my sports life. You know, it's funny talking about that. The Michael Jordan documentary showed you how damn difficult it was. Michael was the best looking player, the most stylish player, the best player. His GM, his owner, Rodman, Pippen. You know, you look back at New England, and to wrap it up, you didn't hear a lot about it. Tom was sort of the good soldier, right? He took the message. He used to do a morning show on Mondays for Boston radio to spread the gospel of Belichick. And I really do think, Lars, and you'll have insight on this, I think for 15 years, it really did work. And then I think about the last 4 or 5 after that Atlanta Super Bowl, I think Tom kind of felt like, okay, I'm 40-year-old Tom now. Like, I am the greatest all time. Even Joe Montana acknowledged, that guy's better than me. But I do think, Lars, for 15 years, he was a very happy player with Belichick.
I agree. And, you know, for the most part, Belichick didn't treat him any different than other players. And, you know, when I was talking to Bruce about Tom, like, hey, do you treat Tom different? He's like, hell yeah, I treat him different. He can take any days off he wants, you know, and if he wants to come into my office and tell me that we need to change the game plan, I'm going to listen, and most likely I'm going to do it. Of course, Bruce, you know, he's a very strong personality. And so it's not going to be just like, okay, Tom gets whatever he wants. I mean, Bruce will light him up, right? And not afraid to do that, either behind closed doors or in front of the media when he thinks that Tom's made a mistake. But I think Tom appreciates that honesty, and he appreciates the relationship that they have and the open communication. And they just like sitting around bullshitting with each other, Colin. I mean, they really enjoy each other's company. And I don't know if Tom, never had that at Michigan, never had that with Belichick, and he's got that with Bruce. And I think Bruce, it truly is. He's like an uncle to Tom, right? He's the guy who's ultimately in charge, but he is the uncle to Tom. One last point I want to make, and I thought this was just absolutely fascinating, was the boat parade. Who else in the United States, who else in America could be publicly intoxicated and yet become more popular because of it? And I think that moment humanized Tom. And I love the fact, you know, the throwing of the Lombardi trophy. The one voice of reason is Tom's daughter yelling, "No, daddy, no, daddy." He does it anyway. And I mean, that may have been the greatest sort of championship parade of all time. And I know it sort of like broke all these COVID protocols and everything, but man, they had a good time. And again, that to me was just the moment where Tom became a true Floridian. It became a true Buck. Was that championship parade?
Yeah, you could. Tampa's always had, and I go back to Ybor City when I was there. It's a party town. Now it's old. There's a lot of people over 55, 60, but it's always sort of had a loose, fun, tropical culture. And when I look back at that parade, and then after it, somebody had their arm around Tom, and he's
just backup quarterback Brian Griffin. Yeah,
that would have been seen as almost, Lars, inappropriate in Foxborough. In fact, it was totally accepted and embraced in Tampa. It's like, Tom, this is us. This is who we are. We celebrate. We get a little tipsy. And I think you really make a point, is that is the reason he chose Tampa. He's been funnier. He's better on social media. He's a funnier interview. It felt like he was at a prep school with a really stern chancellor. And now he's at a really cool public school where the teachers like the students. That's what it feels like to me.
That's a great analogy. It's a great analogy. And the players, they love Bruce because he's a straight shooter. And but he also wants to know sort of what is going on in your life. How can I help you? What sort of advice can I give you if you need anything? What's going on with your girlfriend or your wife? Do you want to talk about it? And Bruce's door is always open. And I've gotten to know Bruce very well, obviously, over the years, and I think the world of him.
Lars, this was an absolute pleasure for me. Please, folks, indulge in the book. It's terrific. And I love people who deeply care about sports and can share stories, because I've always thought that what makes my job so much fun is just the connection, the emotional connection, fans, media, athletes. And when you can break it down, be it a Michael Jordan documentary or a book like this, and share with people, the visceral connection between them and us and the fans in the middle is so much stronger. I think it's wonderful work, great storytelling, Lars, and continued success. And if you see Nick Saban, I really do love him. I think the world of him. Say hi, please.
I will. I'll probably see him here in a few days. So yes, I'll pass along your regards.
All right. Thank you so much, Lars.
Thank you so much, Colin, for having me.